The workshop hummed like a living thing. Lamps swung from the rafters, their halos catching motes of dust and a fine spray of glue. Steam rose where planks were bent in the press, a slow cloud that smelled of resin and boiled wood. Hammers kept a cadence against clamps and cleats, a rhythm that men and women matched with practiced rhythm. Tap, check, tap, set. In the center of the room, a half-built wing lay cradled in a trough of timber, its ribs exposed like the ribs of a ship. Thomas Brackett stood with the heel of his hand on the warm spar, feeling a pulse that was not the blood in his wrist so much as the answer of wood under stress, a tiny, living reply to touch and temperature. He had been called many things in his 45 years. Foreman, steady hand, man who preferred the speak of grain to the bluster of schedules. But here he was simply the man who listened. He read the wood the way others read weather, by the curl of a shaving, the rasp of a plane, the faint sheen where glue had been forced to the surface and held. His fingernail traced a scarf joint and came away gray with dust. He frowned once, not in anger, but in calculation, the kind that bent the body slightly forward and made the jaw set. Across the shop, a young mechanic named Jack Harper tightened a cleat, his knuckles raw and his eyes shaded from the glare. Nearby, women who had worked in furniture shops before the war, some with saw marks still in the hollows of their palms, slid veneers into a heated mold, their hands quick and sure. The problem that had brought them here that winter was simple to say and stubborn in practice. At speed, the wings breathed and then, on certain flights, splintered. Under test loads, the skin would lift from the ribs, or a spar would crack at the glued joint where two lengths of spruce met. The Mosquito's promise, an aircraft that could outrun fighters because it was so light, depended on wings that could carry high loads without the armor of metal. The only way to keep the Mosquito true to that promise was to make wood behave like metal without borrowing its weight. Stay with this story until the breakthrough. If you appreciate deep engineering histories, subscribe and like to hear more about the people who built machines with their hands. They called the wing shops the woodworks, as if the name itself distilled what passed across the benches: wood, craft, economy of motion. The rooms were long and narrow, lined with jigs, skeletons of wings in various stages of completion. Each jig was a geometry of blocks and clamps that held ribs in perfect relation while glue set. Every day, the jigs bore the same rituals: sweep the sawdust, mark the datum line with chalk, measure twice, plane once. Outside, wartime blackout curtains muffled light and traffic. Inside, the work went on, a private sun. Thomas Brackett had arrived at dawn and stayed past midnight on many occasions. He slept in a small bed above the storeroom 3 nights running now. The letters from his wife folded into his breast pocket unread because the ledger required attention. He kept a logbook on his bench, tight, efficient entries in a no-nonsense hand. Materials lot numbers, humidity, glue batch, test load results. Once, when a test report came in with a vibration spike that nobody could explain, Brackett went to the bench and soaked a length of spruce in water. He listened as it dried, tapping its length with a mallet and observing the change in tone. This, more than any calculation, told him that there were subtler forces at work: grain orientation, adhesive creep, and the slow theft of stiffness by humidity cycles. The first cycle of failure had a face. It came as a report from the flight testing field. An aircraft on a high-speed run had returned with a flap of skin half peeled from the upper surface of a wing. There had been no dramatic crash, no catastrophic separation, but the aircraft had borne a wound. In the weeks that followed, the failures multiplied in variety. Some wings delaminated along the trailing edge after prolonged vibration. Others showed stress fractures at the root where wing met fuselage. A statistical eye could reduce these events to percentages and mean times to failure. The human eye, Brackett's eye, saw patterns of craft and fault. A bad batch of adhesive, a rush in the cure cycle, a spar scarfed with insufficient overlap. The engineers at the design office sent papers with calculations that read like prophecies. Improved taper for lift distribution, thicker skins, revised rib spacing. But changes on paper cost time on the line and resources that were rationed by war. The military wanted immediate answers, aircraft to the front, wings that would not betray pilots. The pressure settled on the workshop like a cold fog. A colonel would appear sometimes, stern, crisp, Army-issue overcoat, holding a schedule and asking for assurances. The women who glued veneers looked up and went back to their work. Explaining the technical sides of the wing without losing the feel of the shop required Brackett's gentler statements. In conversation with his young apprentice, he would set aside the dry technical report and say, "Think of the wing like a good rowing boat. The planks have to lie together and share the load. If the join is weak, one plank carries too much and breaks." He showed Jack the spar, 2 or 3 laminations of spruce, each layer's grain oriented to resist bending. The skin was a thin sheath of plywood, layers of veneer glued with opposite grain to make a sheet that would resist warping. The load path, how forces traveled from tip to root, passed through timber, glue, and carefully shaped joints. Any weakness in the path produced stress concentration and ultimately rupture. One of their earliest hypotheses was adhesive failure. Early in the war, many workshops had used casein glue, a protein-based adhesive derived from milk. It had advantages. It was familiar to furniture makers, easy to mix and use. But it was hygroscopic, sensitive to moisture. Aircraft, exposed to condensation and the cold and heat of fast climbs, saw glue lines swell and lose their grip. The chemistry of adhesives was advancing. Synthetic phenolic glues, resin adhesives, and urea formaldehyde resins promised better moisture resistance. But supply and knowledge lagged the need. Switching adhesives meant requalifying processes, testing cure times, and ensuring workers could handle the new materials safely. The shop ran experiments the way a laboratory might, variables controlled in a clumsy, earnest fashion. They glued small coupons, short strips of veneer, under different pressures, in varying humidity, using different mix ratios. They held these coupons in a steam box, then bent them on a rig until the glue joint failed. They plotted results on graph paper with penciled lines, not on computer screens, and pinned the graphs to the workshop wall with thumbtacks. Apprentices would trace their fingers over the curves and learn to read failure modes like a new language. Some solutions were incremental and low drama. Better surface preparation, more aggressive sanding to provide a mechanical key for the glue, longer overlap on scarf joints so the glued area took shear more evenly, different layup schedules so veneers dried and cured without trapping moisture. Others required a leap of trust. One evening, Brackett proposed pressing entire wing halves in a heated mold rather than assembling skins onto ribs in the open. The idea disturbed the production flow. Molds were expensive, presses scarce. But it promised fewer mismatches and much better distribution of glue under pressure. The shop voted. The molds were built. Crude forms hammered by carpenters and seasoned joiners into iron-bound frames. And the first heated press sighed and shuddered as the first wing half took its new shape. Failures came from the most unexpected places. A batch of ribs that had been steam bent in a small plant upstream arrived with a grain orientation that, under test, produced a harmonic that their bending machine could not have predicted. At particular RPM and deflection, a rib would resonate, amplify the vibration, and that vibration concentrated on adhesive lines. The test cell, an isolated bay where wings could be clamped and subjected to cyclic loads, began to look like the place of judgment. The test crew watched gauges, recorded frequencies, and logged minute variations that would help map the problem. The test cell itself was a cathedral of gauges. Oscilloscopes traced vibration. Dial indicators measured deflection to the thousandth of an inch. And strain gauges, small, awkward things then, were bonded to spar faces to read how much stretch occurred under load. Small rituals, lubricating clamps with tallow, marking the cure time with chalk, grew into formalized procedures. These were not glamorous, they were sacred. The day of the decisive endurance run began like any other, but with the air charged by a different quality of attention. The wing lay in the test cell, fully skinned and balanced. On the rig, it would simulate 1,000 flight hours in a few relentless cycles. Brackett moved along the bay, checking each gauge face, tapping a meter to ensure it was set, smoothing a vernier edge with the heel of his hand. Jack Harper, younger and sharper-eyed now after months of trial, tightened a final clamp and stepped back. In the control room, a test pilot who had never set foot in a Mosquito, but who had flown every type in the book, sat with a headset and a log, ready to report the feel of controls and any odd flutter transmitted through the rig's instrumentation. They began at low loads, the rig whispering under the strain. The wing flexed as it would in gentle flight. Then, as the cycles accelerated, the rig simulated takeoff in cruise, then the hard pull of a climb. For hours, the needles trembled and steady, and all night the shop kept its ears and eyes like a surgeon. At 3 in the morning, the first significant resonance appeared on the recorder, a spike that had haunted them in earlier tests. Everyone held their breath as if the wing could overhear and feel their hope. The pitch climbed, then flattened. The viscoelastic inserts had shifted the mode away from the engine harmonic. The difference was not in one single miracle, but in a dozen small adjustments that together produced a stable response. A watch stopped once, then restarted. The instruments recorded the necessary endurance hours with a patience that was not dramatic, but absolute. When the rig slowed and the clamps were eased, there was a moment of silence as the shop recalibrated to the absence of mechanical song. A man in the control room muttered the word that in the workshop had the force of benediction: sustained. There were no cheers, at least none flamboyant. Instead, people moved with a subdued relief, like sailors who had passed through a squall and now stowed lines. Brackett allowed himself a rare smile, then returned to the logbook and wrote the entry with a steady hand. With endurance proven in the cell, the next trial was aerial, bolting the wing to a Mosquito prototype and sending it into the sky. Aircraft flight tests were less forgiving of hesitation. Pilots, who trusted the feel of craft to a certainty developed in air, needed wings that transmitted control with predictable stiffness and damping. The shop's liaison to the flight program was a young flight test engineer named Evelyn Shaw, a woman whose hands had once finished chair arms and who now climbed into cockpits to observe flutter at altitude. She had a voice that could cut through superstition. Her reports bridged the language of the shop and the air. On the morning of the maiden flight with the newly revised wing, the runway lay under a dull sky. Mechanics ran through their checklist with the economy of long practice. Bolts torqued to spec, control runs checked with slips of paper to show travel, fuel and oil levels verified. The pilot, a man who had flown Mosquitoes before, walked the wing slowly, his hand sliding along the plywood skin as if to read its grain. He paused at a joint and nodded once. "It feels right," he said, and the words, simple as they were, steadied the crew. Engines coughed to life, propellers became broader strokes of motion, and the aircraft taxied. Takeoff produced the usual familiar rattle and then a clean rise. Below, in the hangar, the team watched through a bank of factory windows until the plane was a small dot against the cloud. Radios crackled. Evelyn relaying instrument readings, the pilot describing a taut, immediate control feel, and, crucially, no flutter. Over the next hour, the aircraft climbed, turned, and tested high-speed regimes. Data from strain gauges and altimeters was recorded and then cross-checked with the pilot's notes. When the Mosquito returned, people gathered like congregants at a bedside. The pilot climbed down with that particular tiredness of someone who had trusted a machine and come back to testify. He tapped the wing and said, "Solid as a battened hatch." Operational deployments followed with sobering immediacy. Mosquitoes fitted with the wooden wings flew sorties that ranged from reconnaissance to precision strikes. Their speed and range allowed missions that would have been more perilous with heavier metal airframes. Reports reached the workshop in the form of telegrams and short letters. Wing held through 6 passes, minor shaking but no structural signs. Other reports were less sanguine, mentioning aircraft lost to flak or forced down by weather. The workshop took pride in what it had achieved, while keeping record of what they could not control. Technology, they understood, rearranged possibilities. It did not decree outcomes. The wartime context pressed in other ways. Cities burned and were rebuilt. Supply lines were sometimes cut, and adhesives had to be scavenged and substituted with less ideal compounds. The staff grew leaner and younger, as many were conscripted. Women stepped into roles formerly closed to them, their skill evident in the evenness of glue fillets and the steady taper of scarf joints. There was one worker, Mrs. Fletcher, who had come from a small joinery and had the habit of humming while planing. Her hands moved with such pace that apprentices would assemble at her bench to watch. She lost a brother on a raid. She returned to work after the funeral and said nothing. Her bench remained immaculate. The question of the Mosquito's legacy, like the wood itself, had layers. In manufacturing terms, its wooden construction opened the possibility of a wartime industrial base that used non-strategic materials. Furniture shops, boatyards, and small furniture makers were repurposed into aircraft component producers. This decentralization was both boon and constraint. It allowed rapid expansion of production without monopolizing metalworking plants, but it also presented quality assurance challenges. Not every cottage industry could match the precision of a factory designed to build aluminum skins. There were ethical murmurs in the margins. A machine that moved faster and farther could be a tactical advantage and, by extension, a tool of destruction. Brackett and his colleagues were craftsmen by calling. They shaped ply and spruce into instruments that pilots flew, yet their hands were not the ones that dropped bombs. Conversation in the shop turned to practicalities: how to improve fatigue life, how to reduce weight. But their silence on wider moral questions was not indifference so much as a common wartime disassociation, everyone contributing what they could to the war effort while leaving the larger calculus to generals and politicians. When the war ended, the transition felt like a decrescendo rather than a sudden stop. The shop, which had filled night after night with heat and press and tension, cooled slowly. Contracts were cut back. Some workers returned to their towns, to carpentry and cabinet making. Others moved into peacetime aeronautical engineering as the field matured. The wooden wings, once an urgent innovation, became an object of study and later of nostalgia. Years after the clamps were folded away, a Mosquito wing sat in a museum, its varnish glossy under conservation lights. Visitors leaned close and read the plaque that told the technical story in measured prose. Plywood skin, spruce spars, laminated ribs, adhesive advances. Children traced the curvature with gloved hands. A small plaque near the exhibit included a brief dedication to the workers who built the parts by hand, by rhythm. Brackett, now an old man with his fingers browned by a long career, would stand in the gallery and look at the wing as if at a familiar friend.
He sometimes read the names on the donor list and searched for the names of the boatwrights and joiners who had helped in secret ways. He kept in his pocket a folded piece of paper with a list of the exact jigs that had worked best during the war, measurements and notes in his terse script, scraps that in another life had been essential. In the museum, conservators would note that wood ages differently than metal. It retains the fingerprint of hands and the memory of climate. Curators spoke of the Mosquito as a machine that bridged eras, the end of handcrafted aircraft and the dawn of mass-produced metal airframes.
The wing's varnish softened in the light. Its edges had been repaired and stabilized, and a thin line of adhesive, a relic of wartime chemistry, still darkened one scarf seam. For Brackett, who had witnessed the wing's frailties and its eventual steadiness, the exhibit was less about triumph than about proof that patient attention, small experiments, and the sharing of craft across trades could produce something that the sum of its parts might not predict. There were other memorials, quieter ones, a logbook boxed and placed in an archive, pages yellowed and annotated by hands no longer young, a signed photograph of the test crew with grease-streaked faces, a simple plaque in the workshop yard commemorating a machinist who had died in an accident and whose replacement had once fixed the very jig that later proved decisive. These artifacts carried the human residue of making, worn gloves, the smell of linseed, the small ritual of drinking tea between shifts. The technical lessons survived, too. Engineers studied the Mosquito's woodwork for how to manage material anisotropy, the tendency for strength to vary with grain orientation, and for lessons in designing for repairability. The idea of matching layup to load path, of considering adhesive creep over decades, influenced later composite designs. The transition from wood to early composite laminates in the years following the war echoed the same concerns. How to create a skin that shared load without undue added weight. How to ensure joints did not harbor weak points. In classrooms, students pored over the shop graphs, frequency responses, endurance plots, and learned from the elegance of incremental improvements rather than from single grand inventions. One quiet afternoon in the museum, Brackett found himself explaining to a visiting engineering student how to read the surface of a scarf joint. He spoke not like a man reciting theory, but like someone telling a story. Where the joint began, how the glue would be trimmed, how the clamping would be staged so that vapors evaporated instead of forming blisters. The student took notes, eyes wide at the physicality of the method. And Brackett felt for a moment that everything had come full circle. The craft secrets had been taught, preserved, and placed within reach of a new generation. If there was an elegy in Brackett's life, it was not a lament for machines lost, but a measured recognition of change. He had loved the smell of hot glue and sawdust, the way a plane of wood accepted a plane's iron and offered a clean curl. He was not blind to the fact that faster metals and later jet engines changed the priorities of aircraft design. But he carried, like an old watch, the memory of a time when hands could shape the fate of flight. Sitting in the museum cafe, he traced the rim of a cup and thought of the test cell silence after a run, the moment when the roar subsided and workmen considered what had been learned. The story of the Mosquito's wooden wings is a story of craft meeting necessity, of boat builders teaching aviators, of furniture makers becoming aircraft workers, of adhesives evolving under pressure, and of a small army of hands that translated design into usable structure. It is also, unavoidably, a story bound up with the uses to which that craft was put. The wings permitted missions that were daring. They also fed an engine of war. That conflict remains outside any single set of hands, and yet imprinted itself upon the workshop. This was a place of doing, not of deciding geopolitics. In the end, the wing spoke of an era when making was audible. The rasping of planes, the reluctant hiss of steam presses, the sibilant setting of glue. The heartbeat motif, gauges oscillating, a pilot's pulse quickening at takeoff, threaded through the account as a reminder that machines, however ingeniously built, are inseparable from the people who make and fly them. The Mosquito's woodwork taught an engineering lesson about materials and joints, but it taught a human lesson too, that persistence, humility before material behavior, and collaborative problem-solving could produce an elegant answer to a stubborn problem. Brackett took his logbook home at the end of the workday and read the first entries by lamplight. He had a line in there, written years before, that still sat like a declaration: "Measure twice, listen always." It was not a slogan, but a practice. The wing in the museum bore the mark of that practice. Visitors leaned close, read the tiny printed placards, and sometimes stood for a long time, perhaps thinking of a father, a grandfather, or an old craftsman who had once tapped a spar and known how the wing would answer. Outside, the city moved on. New factories rose, aluminum plants expanded, jet engines took to the sky. Inside the museum, the wooden wing waited, its curve a reminder of a period when wood, glue, and human attention combined to meet an urgent need. The story would be told in lectures, in archival reels, in the quiet tapping of conservators restoring a seam. And for those who had been there, the woodworkers, the boatwrights, the test crews, the wing remained a testament to what hands could accomplish when directed by relentless curiosity and the sober discipline of craft. The workshop had been a crucible of sorts, its fires not of metal alone, but of trial, correction, and small, stubborn triumphs. In that crucible took shape an object that could, in the right hands and with the right knowledge, carry men across long stretches of sea and sky. The memory of that making, the archived drawings, and the signed logbooks preserved a particular kind of human achievement, the slow accretion of wisdom that turned failure into an eventual, durable solution. And Brackett, standing once more before the preserved wing, closed his fingers into the grain, feeling the smoothness left by many hands, and listened, though no machine hummed now, knowing that somewhere in the curve of that wood was the echo of 1,000 small decisions that had carried strangers into safety and sometimes into peril. He folded his hands and let himself be, for a rare moment, satisfied. The wing did not absolve the past, nor did it celebrate it. It simply existed, a work of craft, and an invitation to remember the workers who had brought it into being. He left the museum with the wing's curve still mapped behind his eyes, like a faint blueprint pressed upon the lid of his skull. The city evening had a softness, industry's edge smoothed by the long shadow of winter, and Brackett walked with the kind of slow gait that comes from decades of measured movement. Not a man broken, but one who had learned the economy of his steps. At the end of the block, he paused beneath a street lamp and unfolded his logbook. The lamp pooled a small, steady light over the page, and for a moment the present and the past were indistinguishable. Ink splayed the same, whether written by hand or machine, and a hand that once lay templates upon a bench still felt the familiar agency of making whenever it traced letters in the margin. He had kept every scrap, a torn sketch here, a yellowed payslip there, a photograph stuck to a page with a glue that had long since browned. There was a picture of the workshop's core team taken in 1943. Men and women arranged in a careful informality, faces serious with the gravity of work and the gravity of what might come next. He recognized most of them by shape and posture more than by face. Mallory with the cigarette stub tucked behind his ear. Perkins with his hands stained in varnish. Elsie Summers, her jaw firm, paint speckled across her apron. She had been one of the furniture makers who transferred to aircraft work in the first frantic year. She had a squared-off profile in the photograph, like a plane's cutaway. Later accounts would call her the best grader of scanting and curvature. Brackett drew his thumb across her face in the photo and felt the familiar tug of memory. The way her laugh had filled the echoing space of the test cell's observatory. The way she would stand with arms folded at the rear of the bench and watch a spar's deflection as if waiting for it to confess something. He had once, in a lighter hour, asked her how she could tell when the glue had set perfectly. She had shrugged and said, "You listen, it tells you when it's had enough." They had laughed then, but the truth of the remark lodged like a splinter. The craft insisted upon a kind of patience that the war's urgency sometimes made difficult to love. The logbook held other entries. A brief, heavily penned note about a late-night repair before a ferry flight. Names of men who had signed to travel with the aircraft. A diagram of a joint annotated with adjustments recommended by the test pilot. There was also a small envelope folded into the spine. It contained a letter written in a rush of trembling script, from a navigator's wife thanking someone for a piece of the aircraft that had been returned after a hard landing. Brackett remembered that mission, though the name had been lost to him. He remembered the spar with a burn mark, the way the grain had swollen from heat, how a seam that had been thought irreparable had been coaxed back into place. The man had come back, a gray shadow, and his wife wrote to thank whoever had reworked the emergency piece. It was the kind of note that made a man want to stop the world and ask permission to be kinder. On the bus home the next morning, Brackett found himself watching the hands of younger passengers. He noted the precision with which a woman on a phone scrolled through images, the way a tradesman checked his wrenching torque at the site with a flick of his wrist. There were new hands to learn old trades, he thought. Perhaps that thought was the bridge between the wing and the bustle outside. He had been in the shop when they first brought plywood into aircraft design for the Mosquito. At the time, it had seemed a radical bet. Joiners and cabinet makers teaching aviators how to think in layers and glue rather than in rivets and forging. The arguments had been sharp in the early hours. Doubts about durability at altitude, worries about moisture and tension. But necessity had a certain rhetorical power. And when necessity spoke, the men who could read grain answered. He went back to the workshop, not because the museum needed him. 2 full-time curators maintained the exhibits, but because habit made a pilgrimage out of memory. The building that had housed the wartime shop was now a conservation annex for the museum, and within its quieter rooms, conservators worked with the same concentration Brackett remembered in the old cruise. He was allowed to visit, to stand at a distance and watch as a young restorer named Mark Liddell measured a spar with digital calipers. The instruments read out precise to decimals that had not existed when Brackett first filed edges. Mark had a careful way of holding a piece of old wood, as if it might admit a confidence to those who asked politely. Brackett appreciated that. He liked the quiet of Mark's concentration. It reminded him that the work, in its essence, had not altered. Only its tools had. "Mr. Brackett," Mark said one afternoon, looking up from a bench. He was slight and young in the way that makes youth look like a proposition rather than a fact. "Do you mind if I ask about the scarfing technique you used on the ribs? The records note a double lap, but your handwriting in the margin suggests a taper of 2 to 1. Brackett glanced at the piece and felt his old self come forward, the set of his shoulders, the way his tongue found the right technical word. 2 to 1 gave us room for the join to breathe, he said. It let the glue draw through without choking the fibers. You want surface for adhesion, but not so much that you create a stiff seam. Mark listened like a man receiving a gift. "It's odd," he said then, "how much of what we're doing now is reverse engineering intuition. We'll simulate loads, model moisture expansion, but in the end, we still rely on a decision that someone like you made with a hand and a rule of thumb." "And a habit of listening," Brackett supplied. "Always listen." The restorer smiled. He did not come from the same age of apprenticeship as Brackett. He had been trained in a conservatorship program and could cite material science papers with the ease of quoting lines from a play. But there was a shared grammar in their work: measurement, attention, a respect for correction. And Brackett found that these days often left him less lonely than the city around him. Not every story archived in the workshop led to quiet satisfaction. A certain weight was always present in the records: the catalog of missions flown, the names crossed out on rosters, repairs that had been made in haste, and forgiveness that had come with the washing salt of crashed beachings and emergency landings. Brackett had sat in the tribunal of engineers once, not to judge a soul, but to study failure. A Mosquito had failed over the channel when a spar sheared under unusual loading. The pilot had managed to bring it to land, but 2 crewmen had been injured. The inquiry found a combination of factors: an unusually severe gust, a fatigue crack masked by paint, a hurried repair patch that had not been sufficiently torqued. Brackett remembered the meeting room: models laid out, charts annotated, men speaking in clipped tones, uncomfortable with the human consequences of their calculations. They had all been careful to speak in mechanisms. But there had come in the later hours a thin silence, and in that silence another voice, Perkins, famously blunt, had said, "We make pieces that carry people. Treat them as if you're sending your boy on a Sunday trip." The room had not laughed. Obscurely, everyone felt exposed. There are technicalities that can be rehearsed, and processes that can be audited, but there remain decisions that require the moral hazard of imagining your own family in the frame. Duty and craft interleaved until the two were almost indistinguishable. That incident had altered some small things in the shop. They introduced stricter checks, a system for double verification on critical joints, a log that required 2 signatures before any repaired spar left the bench. Such changes were, by definition, prosaic, but within them lived sorrow's repudiation of negligence. Brackett had signed the new logs. He had watched men and women who had been brash in their youth become solemn in their middle years, not because the world demanded it, but because they now had a feel for the consequences. On Saturdays, the museum hosted a series of public talks. Brackett was one of the invited storytellers, not a formal lecturer, but a living stitch that connected exhibits to the men who had made them. He would stand before a modest crowd and, with a cup of paper coffee in hand, tell of how a particular joint had been discovered, or how the boat builders had taught the team to scarf curves that would resist the sea's torsion. People liked those stories. Children liked them best, eyes wide at the idea that wood could carry a plane like an arm the size of a house. At a talk, a woman once asked him why they had not used metal from the start, why they had chosen a material so seemingly fragile. Brackett had thought of the question for a long beat, fingers around his coffee, and answered, "Because sometimes the thing that looks weakest at first is the thing that gives you the problem's gentlest solution. Wood bends softly. It tells you when it's beyond its limit. Metal will hold like a stubborn man and then suddenly let go." He had watched that image land on the faces in the front row. Some nodded, some furrowed their brows. He had been pleased at the attention. Satisfaction does not always come from being understood, but in being listened to. There were other narratives bristling at the edges, personal stories that had no place in an exhibit label. He thought of Elsie Summers again. She had left the workshop after the war with a crate of chair designs and a small, angry scar on her knuckle where a plane of wood had bitten. He had heard she opened a small shop that repaired old furniture, that she never stopped shaping wood into chairs that seemed to make room for bodies. He once found a postcard from her among his papers, the handwriting brisk. "Keep the old ways, Bram. They are worth your listening." He had never replied. There is often a humility in failing to answer a friend whose life has chosen a different orbit. Not all farewells had remained private or gentle. Brackett had carried for years the knowledge of an error he had made, a misjudged thickness on a sparse cap that had required an emergency patch before a night sortie. The plane had gone and returned, the crew had been shaken but safe, and the miscalculation had been quietly adjusted in subsequent production. He had told no one for a long time, because confession can be a dangerous currency in a place that counts lives in the ledger of performance. Yet in older age, the weight of such secrets grows heavy, not because of shame, but because the body remembers the cost. He had finally written an apology on a scrap of paper and left it in the toolbox of a colleague who had already died. He carried the small moral relief as one might carry an abraded tool, practical and modest. On a winter morning, a man came to the museum with a box of artifacts wrapped in newspaper. He introduced himself as the son of a navigator and asked if the museum would accept the items for the archive. Marigold-streaked maps, a faded cap, a worn leather notebook filled with navigational calculations and personal sketches. Little drawings of a daughter with lopsided braids, a boat on a pond. The conservator on duty, careful and courteous, arranged for the objects to be catalogued. The son lingered, looking often toward the wing exhibit. "My father," he said suddenly, "always said the Mosquito got him home more than once. He liked that it was wood. He used to say, 'Wood talks to you. It won't lie.'" Brackett found his throat tight. He thought of the innumerable small ways people had entrusted their lives to things he had helped make. He thought of the navigator's little sketches, the child's boat, the way a man might sing to objects like a parent hums to a child. He walked with the son down the hall and, impulsively, opened his logbook and turned to a page where he had written a list of minor repairs made to a particular aircraft sent on coastal patrol. He had added, in his own crabbed hand, a note about a navigator's favorite pen that had been returned. He passed the page over. The man's hands trembled. There are gestures that feel like restitution, not because they change history, but because they give acknowledgement where none had been expected. The city's winters were long. Brackett learned to take small pleasures. The light at dawn on the curve of the wing in the museum gallery, the muffled sound of traffic, the way tea tasted better when poured into a chipped cup. His days settled into a rhythm of mornings at the conservatory, afternoons in the reading room poring over technical drawings, evenings writing marginalia in the logbook, because writing anchored memory in a way silence did not. He began to mentor a group of volunteers, young people curious about woodworking, veterans anonymous in the crowd who liked the tactile reassurance of sanded surfaces. He taught them how to feel for grain, how to plane with the wood rather than against it, how to read a plan not as instruction but as conversation. One volunteer, a lanky teenager named Sam, surprised Brackett with an intuitive sense. Sam responded to correction without the indignation some apprentices wore as armor. He would stop, look, then begin again, as if a direction had been a map, not a rebuke. "Why wood?" Sam asked once, during a lull. "Why keep working with it when everything else is metal?" Brackett smiled. He could have given the technical answer, the material strength-to-weight ratio, the wartime economy that made wood abundant, but instead he spoke of the private language of making. "Because it listens," he said, echoing Elsie's old phrase. "Because when you work with wood, you are always responding. It won't pretend. If you force it, it will tell you." "The skill is in hearing," Sam nodded, as if that were a sufficient system of physics. Outside the quiet sphere of the museum and the bench, the city changed more quickly. New factories replaced old ones, and with them came new expectations of speed. There were discussions of replacing historical exhibits with interactive arrays, of digitizing archives so that anyone in the world could view them. Brackett was not opposed to the idea. He understood the reach of preservation and the duty to educate. But when he thought of the wing, he saw hands, not screens. He feared that attention might drift to the chime of a new interface, while the subtlety of a scarf joint remained unappreciated. The director of the museum approached Brackett one autumn and asked if he would participate in a short film they were producing, a vignette featuring veterans and workers who had been involved in wartime aircraft production. Brackett consented, on the condition that the film would not romanticize the subject. He wanted the footage to speak honestly, to show skill, yes, but also fatigue, to show craft, but also the human cost that clings to all things forged for war. On the day of the shoot, Brackett found himself sitting under lights and talking about the wing in a steady voice that felt both public and private. He told the camera about measuring twice and listening always. He spoke of the men and women who had become, in the workshop's intense economy, a community not by choice, but by necessity. He recounted how they once taught a new intake of carpenters to sand a leading edge until it spoke with a certain ring. "We used to have contests," he said, to a small smile in the crew, "to see who could make the cleanest curl of shavings. It sounds trivial, but that's how we learned tenderness." At the end of the day, a woman with a soft voice, one of the film editors, handed Brackett an envelope. Inside were letters from old colleagues, typed and neatly folded, that the production team had collected from families. They were small, plain things. "Hello, Brackett. Your handwriting was like a map to me," one read. "Thanks for holding our work to be proud of," another. He sat on the museum steps with the envelope in his lap and thought of all the forms gratitude can take. Letters, repaired artifacts, a cup of tea poured by a hand that once held a rasp. It occurred to him then that the wing in the museum had become a kind of altar for those thanks. Yet gratitude rarely absolved the past. There were still families who wrote with anger, or not at all. There were still men and women whose bodies bore damage that no logbook could ever reconcile. Brackett had learned the necessity of living with such regret. He had also learned the practice of small reparations, writing a line to a widow, visiting a graveside once in a while, speaking the names of the dead so they did not evaporate into anonymity. At once, these acts felt like gentle, inadequate stitches, and like essential work that remembered humanity in the ledger of things. Winter thinned into spring, and with the thaw came an invitation to a reunion at the Guildhall, a modest gathering of former workers, conservators, and families. Brackett prepared in the cool hours before the meeting by reading through the logbook entries connected to those who would attend. He wore an old jacket with a small tear indented at the elbow. He had chosen it deliberately, as if mending was a visible profession. When he entered the room, he was greeted by murmurs and hands extended. Some faces had softened into unfamiliarity. Others were as sharp as their photographs. Elsie's absence was a small ache. A note on the table explained she had moved away to care for an ailing sister. He wrote her name on his palm and kept it there like a petal. The evening's conversations wandered between the technical and the tender. A former foreman began telling a story of a seam they couldn't quite close, and the room listened as if they had all been present in that cramped space decades ago. A woman from the museum's education team spoke about the importance of telling material stories to young people. Brackett found himself saying very little. When he did speak, he chose sentences with care. "The work will outlast us in ways we don't reckon," he told the assembled group. "But it's the way we spoke to it that will teach others. Do not think that the object alone will carry the lesson. It needs a voice." They applauded then, not out of performative gratitude, but as a gesture of mutual recognition. Later, when the hall had emptied and the lights were dimmed to a comforting amber, Brackett lingered at the window and watched the night's weather change the way the city's glass shimmered. He felt, beneath the satisfied posture of an older man, an ongoing obligation to tell carefully, to guard the fidelity of workmanship,
to remember that the Mosquito's wings had been more than a technological fix. They had been a congregation of hands conversing with the material world in a moment of emergency. The story was not simple nor pure. It carried the moral residue of its uses, but it also carried the small, luminous fact of human skill. He walked home with his pocket full of signatures and the echo of conversations. He did not imagine spectacle ahead, no grand reconciliations, no sudden bursts of communal absolution. Instead, he carried an insistence that memory needs tending like any living thing. The wing in the museum would be tended by conservators and explained by curators. But the human aspect, how making had shaped men and women, would need living witnesses. Brackett resolved to continue telling those stories as long as he could, to be a steward of a truth that was both practical and moral. Before turning into his building, he stopped at a street bookstall and purchased a small paperback on shipbuilding techniques.
He liked the overlap of ideas. Even in the book's thin, modern prose, there were precepts that echoed the shop. The importance of lap, of grain orientation, of a humbler patience. He would read it by lamplight and perhaps note a line in the logbook. There is a comfort in accumulating knowledge, in believing that the smallest corrections, an adjusted scarf angle here, a more careful glue application there, can alter the course of events in ways both quiet and vital. At home, he opened a drawer and took out an old plane, its wood smoothed by years of use. He ran his thumb along the sole and felt in the familiar vibration the company's hum. Planes that had been honed for a different century, but that still spoke the language of cutting, of shaving material away until a surface could answer a need. He set the plane on the table, and though the city hummed beyond his window with modern machines and modern haste, in the small lamp-lit room, the older rules held. Listen, measure, correct, repeat. He made himself a cup of tea and, with the logbook open on his lap, wrote a note to be placed in a new folder the museum had requested, an oral account of the day we discovered the scarf. He wrote not to boast, but to provide a roadmap, how decisions had been made under duress, how they had been corrected, what they had taught the next generation. His hand moved with a steady economy, the same economy that had once laid out the geometry of a rib. When he paused, the room held its breath with him. The wings curve, the test cells hush, the rasping planes. All those earlier sounds seemed to thin into a single thread he could now trace with ink. There is an art to ending an account that refuses to be neat. Brackett did not search for conclusion so much as he reached for a responsible continuity, the kind that keeps a craft alive by passing its rules along, raw and unglossed. He closed the logbook and felt, beneath the modest triumph of handed-on knowledge, a patient's contentment. The wing waited in the museum, an answer to a set of problems, a reminder of talent, an object that would be described and measured and touched by respectful hands. That would have to be enough for now. He turned off the lamp and set the plane back in its drawer, not as one who has finished a life, but as one who has found another day's reason to rise and listen. The city outside held its own long tales, but inside his quiet house, the old habits were not yet relics. They were instructions for the living, for anyone who would be wise enough to listen. He put out the light and, with the wing's curve still in his mind, closed the door on another night of careful remembering.